With regard to Ukraine and Russia, and therefore the question of what America's commitment to Europe looks like, it's very hard to read that situation. It looked up until recently like Trump was trying to greatly reduce the American military footprint in Europe and shift the burden of dealing with Russia in Ukraine over to the Europeans. Um, and That appears to have changed, though. If you look at what happened at the G7 meeting in France in mid-June, and if you look at what happened at the NATO summit in Ankara in early July, it looks like, if anything, the Americans have enthusiastically, and here we're talking about President Trump, he has enthusiastically endorsed the European campaign to help Ukraine wage war against Russia. So it doesn't look like our commitment to Europe and to NATO is at the moment being diminished. But it's very hard to say how this will play itself out over time. In good part because Trump changes his view, every other day. And, he can turn on the Europeans on a dime. So who knows exactly what will happen there. But for the time being, it looks like this disaster in the Gulf is not having negative effects on the NATO alliance.
Well, just as follow up on the NATO alliance, it does appear that a key, well, narrative push at the moment, especially coming out of Europe and Ukraine, is that the tide has turned. Ukraine is winning, and it's quite likely this is what is impacting Trump's decision, because he's made some comments to that end. That is arguing that, well, the Ukrainians are doing very well now, and this is kind of the common talking point from all the European leaders as well. And I do see, especially a lot of the Russian oil tankers in the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov having been hit. But how do you see this? Do you see a shift in the tide of this war, or is this, yeah? Well, as I spoke 2 weeks or 3 weeks ago with George Beebe, and he, the former CIA director for Russia analysis, and he essentially called it NATO war propaganda. But again, the Ukrainians are getting are hitting things. The capabilities are growing. The involvement of the West is growing. So how do you see this? How significant did you see a shift here, or do you think this? Well, what impacts Trump is just narrative control?
Well, I think what impacts Trump is the narrative. I think the argument is being made in the propaganda campaign in the West that not only is the drone war, which you described, working very well, but also the Russians are in deep trouble on the battlefield. In effect, the Ukrainians have turned the tide and, if not just stymied, have not just stymied the Russians, but beginning to push them back in particular places. So it's not just the drone war, it's also what's happening on the battlefield. And then I think the third dimension in the propaganda campaign is to make the argument that the Russian economy is hurting badly and Putin is becoming increasingly unpopular, and it's not clear that he can remain in office. So if we keep up the drone campaign and we continue to help Ukraine on the battlefield, that will in effect topple Putin at some point, do damage to the Russian economy, and in effect will knock the Russians out of the ranks of the great powers. You remember early in the war, in the first year of the war, 2022, the Americans occasionally talked openly about delivering a significant defeat to Russia and knocking it out of the ranks of the great powers. And you actually see that kind of rhetoric coming back. And I think the Americans are once again making the argument that sanctions provide a magic tool for damaging Russia. Not just drones, but sanctions as well. And as you know well, Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal, two senators, had long been pushing a new sanctions bill against Russia. And it looks like that bill, although it's been watered down a bit, is likely to pass the Senate. And Trump has said that he likes the bill. And this is a bill that's designed to cripple the Russian economy. Just very important to understand that. We're back to aiming to cripple the Russian economy. And Trump endorses the bill. Uh, and you have to marry that to what's going on in this drone war. It's quite clear that the Europeans believe that they can help Ukraine win the drone war, the long-range drone war, not the drone war on the battlefield so much. But they can give huge numbers of drones to the Ukrainians and help the Ukrainians build up their industrial capability to produce drones. And that will allow Ukraine to inflict serious damage on the Russian economy and on Russian military capabilities. That's the story they tell. So I think what's happening here is that the West, to include the United States, is ramping up the pressure on Russia because they think they're winning the war. Now, I want to be very clear. I think if you look at what's happening on the battlefield, and I think the battlefield is what really matters, I think the Russians are winning. They're rolling back the Ukrainians. The Ukrainian army is in desperate straits. The only thing that's really keeping it going is the presence of drones. I think there's no question about that on the battlefield. But it's not clear that the Russians won't ultimately overwhelm the Ukrainian forces because they're stretched so thin. So I think on the battlefield, which matters the most, the Russians are winning. But there's no question that we're back to sanctions. And we think that this drone campaign, this long-range drone campaign, can have a significant effect on the Russian economy and on Putin's standing.
Yeah, well, I saw, I think it was today, von der Leyen, she was making the statement that they now have an agreement between the EU and Ukraine for co-producing drones. And it seems also like an effort to have the EU make more long-range drones to attack deep inside Russia. And, well, essentially say, well, we're not transferring drones, we're not participating, these are, Ukrainian made. But it kind of begs the question because, where this is all going. Because the Russians are looking at to what extent the West is involved in this. And, it's a difficult question to answer because there's a lack of evidence. There's a lot of war propaganda out there. On the other hand, it's very hard to imagine, for especially the drone attacks on St. Petersburg, that they weren't, being assisted by NATO to attack. But what do we actually know about NATO's involvement in these attacks on Russia?
Well, let me come at this from a slightly different angle than I usually approach the subject. Uh, I believe that one of the principal reasons that the Russians attacked Ukraine in February of 2022 is they believed, quite correctly, I think, that Ukraine was becoming a de facto member of NATO. Now, if you fast forward to the present, I think that what's happening here is, and you can hear it in the rhetoric from people in the West, that Ukraine has gone to great lengths to, in effect, become not only a de facto member of NATO, but a de facto member of the EU. And it's very important to understand that the EU has become a more militarized institution since the war started in February of 2022. So when Ukraine works overtime to become a de facto member of NATO and a de facto member of the EU. What that means is that you have an intermingling, a coming together of Ukrainian military capabilities, Ukrainian intelligence, and Western intelligence, and the ability to build weapons. I mean, Trump said that he was going to grant the Ukrainians a license to build Patriot missiles inside of Ukraine. Just think about what this means. This is just another way of saying Ukraine is becoming a de facto member of NATO, a de facto member of the EU. It's being integrated into the West militarily. And again, at the same time, what's happening here is we're going back to sanctions in a big way with this Blumenthal-Graham bill. And we have the drone campaign, the long-range drone campaign. So I think from Russia's point of view, it is very clear that the West is joined together with Ukraine, even if Ukraine is not a formal member of the EU or a formal member of NATO, and that it is the West, to include the United States now, and Ukraine, that is waging war against Russia. And I think if you listen to the Russians speak, they are in effect saying that is the case. They understand what's going on. You and I are not the only two people on the planet who have figured this out. So the question the Russians face is, what do they do about this? And that what they do about it is a function of two factors. Number one, how serious is the threat? How serious is the threat of new sanctions? How serious is the problem of a long-range drone campaign against the Sea of Azov, against the Black Sea, against Crimea, against Moscow, and so forth and so on? How serious is that threat? And then the question is, what are the targets that the Russians can hit in Europe to bring an end to this close coordination between the Europeans on one hand and the Ukrainians on the other hand? It's not obvious what the Russians can do to break the growing link between Ukraine and the West. And this, of course, segues into the whole Sergei Karaganov argument about what Russia should do in the face of this threat. But the point I'm making to you, Glenn, just to encapsulate my argument, is that Ukraine and the West are growing closer and closer together. The West is becoming more invested in the Ukraine war than it ever has been. And from the Russian point of view, it's quite clear that what the West and Ukraine together want to do is they want to defeat Russia. And the question is, how can Russia avoid that outcome?
Yeah, well, I have to say now, yeah, from Moscow as well, that they see now the diplomacy with the US as being essentially nonsense, while with the Europeans there's no diplomacy at all. And as you said, I think there's a good understanding now that NATO's waging a war on Russia. But given this problem that is Ukraine and Europe or even NATO are growing closer and closer together, how do you think this will impact though, the Russian, I guess, objectives for what the end of the war will look like? Because again, the Russians invaded in 2022 to decouple Ukraine from the NATO alliance because they see this as an existential threat. Does this increase then or expand the demands in war? Do they need more territory? I saw, Putin, he made a reference to liberating Novorossiya, and that's a very different piece of territory. Now you're talking Nikolaev, you're talking Odessa, you're talking Kharkov. I mean, this is very different territorial ambition. Is this where they're headed, given that there is no diplomatic path? There's no willingness to even talk to Russia from the European, from where the Europeans are. But also, as you said, if they're getting closer and closer, any deal that comes with a promise of Ukrainian neutrality, I would assume it wouldn't be worth much, because as we've seen now with the war on Iran, we can sign any documents we want. We're not actually going to implement them. So how do you think the war objectives of Russia is changing, given that the West is wedding itself so closely now to Ukraine?